Welcome to our program 1.6, Rising and Your Critical Role in Climate Change. We're in the studio of Drexel University's student-run WKDU 91.7 FM on the dial. I'm Diane Davis. I'm a doctoral student at Drexel University, and I am your host and moderator for this program segment series. And this is a public service program for the general listening audience. We are pleased to be speaking this morning with Dr. Mary Katherine Gonder. She is a professor of biology at Drexel University. And Dr. Gonder has recently joined the biology department and has her own laboratory, the Gonder Laboratory, which she has taken over the leadership at Drexel University. And Dr. Gonder has a very distinguished and well-defined research background in the pan-troglodytes elliot, which is Latin for Nigeria, Cameroon, chimpanzee. And since it is a primate, it is a very close species to humans. And Dr. Gonder has devoted pretty much her whole research career to this particular primate. Dr. Gonder's research lab concentrates on a number of different things affecting the population and the ability of the chimpanzees to procreate from one generation to another. And Dr. Gonder's laboratory unites more than 150 different researchers and students from the United States, Africa, and Europe. And these research efforts are seeking to identify meaningful conservation measures that will mitigate the effects of habitat loss and climate change in Western equatorial Africa. The research includes both in-field work and laboratory work where the data analysis is undertaken, and then the science is furthered by the scholarly research efforts to publish in juried journals. Before we discuss the chimpanzees of Cameroon, Nigeria, which have been listed as a critical species on the IUCN Red List, Dr. Gonder, could you please explain for us, to our listening audience, what the IUCN list is and what the Red List is, and how it comes about each year?
The IUCN stands for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It is a volunteer organization, and it's in fact the largest volunteer organization of scientists with interests in biology and wildlife in the whole world. It's the organization itself is over 65 years old, and it has grown over time. The functions of the IUCN have grown from being a clearinghouse for information about certain species to being a very comprehensive organization that does something called a red list assessment, which assesses the threat status of different organisms and the likelihood that they will become extinct over a certain time period. So the way the IUCN is organized is it's a broad group of scientists with interests in their own little individual organisms, often that they will study. For example, there is a marine turtle specialist group, there's an amphibian specialist group, and there's the group that I study, that part of that section, that study section, and that's the primate specialist group. And basically we are responsible for reviewing the literature about, assessing conservation threats to all species that belong to the order Primates, including the Nigeria Cameroon chimpanzee, which its Latin name is Pan troglodytes elioti. So we do a lot of different kinds of assessments. Red list assessments categorize different species and subspecies as well on the basis of whether or not they are of least concern, which is the best case scenario for a species, whether they're vulnerable, which means that there are threats that threaten their populations that could reduce their numbers in the future, or whether they're endangered, which means that they have a likelihood of extinction over a certain period of time, or if they're critically endangered, which means that they're likely to go extinct, or 90% of their population is likely to be lost within 3 generations. And so that they're categorized that way, or then there's this other category, and whether or not if there's data deficiencies. And if they're data deficient, that means that there's not enough information available to really assess how they fit into any of those categories. So that's what we do in the primate specialist group. I've been a member of the group for about 10 years now, but I also serve within a subunit of the primate specialist group, and that's the section on great apes, because I am one of few people in the world who spends a lot of time out in the field in Nigeria and Cameroon to really assess what's going on with the Nigeria Cameroon chimpanzee. My research requires me to travel around a lot and see a lot, so I contribute a lot to the section on great apes. And so what our task is in the great apes, in the section on great apes, is that we assess periodically, about every 5 to 7 years, the conservation status of different groups. So the thing that I contribute the most to directly to the red list assessments is the status of the Nigeria Cameroon chimpanzee and the likelihood that it's going to go extinct. And basically it wavers from being critically endangered to being endangered. Right now we've upgraded its status to endangered from the critically endangered list, which it was on for several years when it first began to be listed, which it only began to be listed about 15 years ago or so. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I understand that it's up to 41,415 species now, which it has grown considerably since 1979. And I remember you're mentioning in our pre-recording session that talk that there are many more researchers now providing research information throughout the world on many different species. And so the wealth of information has grown tremendously that contributes to the list. We'd like to hear about your research at the Bioko Preservation Program in Central Africa, which you've been working on since 2013,
right?
Since you came to assume the leadership of the BIOKO program at Drexel University.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, I have been working in Central Africa since for about 25 years. And as a result of that, Drexel is just a really unique place. Most places, most universities, if it's not at a Central African university, they don't really care about what's happening in Central Africa. So Drexel's totally unique. It's this unbelievable program in the middle of Central Africa and on the tiny remote island of Bioko. So the way I got involved in the program is that Bioko Island is an island that's located 37 kilometers off the coast of Cameroon. And I met the founder of the Bioko program some years ago at a conference in Scotland, and we became close friends. And when she decided that she was going to retire, she started looking around for a predecessor, and unbelievably, Drexel decided they wanted to keep this program going. And so they offered me the position after the directorship was advertised some years back. And so what makes it so unique, the BIOKO program, is that it's a partnership between Drexel University and the National University of Equatorial Guinea, which we call UNHE, based on its acronym in Spanish. And it's such a unique program. There's not anything like it in all of Central Africa, and it's where students from Drexel and students from UNHE, they work together in partnership to do research projects. We had Drexel has had a study abroad program there for many years that runs 2 terms every single year. So it's not just a one-off thing that the people, we from Drexel show up, we do some work in Central Africa, and we leave. We're true partners. We work together. And that's something that unites all the biodiversity research that we do, is that we like to have students partner together across cultures and engaged in long-term and meaningful research. So that's one part of the program. Other parts of the program are that we do a lot of translational research, which means we take basic biological research and we translate it into policy recommendations, and then those recommendations are often incorporated into legislation in the country of Equatorial Guinea. That's something that I'm very interested in because of my work with IUCN, because I've been doing this with chimpanzees for a long time. I'm really interested in how to do this for protected areas and how you incorporate research truly to make meaningful environmental recommendations. So yes, I took over leadership of the program in 2013, and it's my great pleasure. The BBPP is absolutely unique. It's such a powerful and unique program, and it's great to be here.
Dr. Gonder, can you tell us what is so special about these wonderful chimpanzees?
So the Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzee is really interesting to study. The reason why it's interesting to study is because when I started doing my dissertation, very little was known about chimpanzees in Nigeria and Cameroon, and for various reasons there were some papers that came out that really made my PhD advisor and me want to understand these chimpanzees. So I will tell you, before my dissertation, they didn't exist. The name Pan-Troglodytes ellioti had been lost to the mist of time, and nobody recognized this 4th subspecies of chimpanzee. So many years ago, I started working on this problem. In fact, I went over, chimpanzees sleep in nests, and I climbed up in the trees and we collected hairs and we brought them back, and I used them as a source of DNA. It's like chimpanzee CSI, right? And that's basically what I do. Was with hairs, now with poop. So we brought this back. We looked at the genetic data, and we looked at how these chimpanzees were related to other chimpanzees across Africa. And what we found was that chimpanzees in Nigeria and Cameroon were different than chimpanzees anywhere else. And on that basis, we proposed that they should be a new subspecies of chimpanzee. So I was very young at the time. I was only like 25 or so, and this was in the days of snail mail. So I wrote up a paper really fast and sent it off to Nature, and then disappeared back into the forest to go collect more samples to try to verify this and try to understand all these things about it, address all these questions that had come up as a result of the research. Well, unbelievably, the paper was published in Nature, and I made these claims based on a very small number of samples that this should be a new subspecies. And so it led to all this controversy, because it's not every day that you find a new subspecies or a new kind of mammal, let alone this undiscovered reservoir of genetic diversity in great apes, right? So it was this big news. It was covered in the New York Times. It was in Nature. It was all this stuff. So all of these things happened, and unfortunately, I didn't realize how professors were, that, we're very staid. We really analyze data very thoroughly. We don't just write papers in Nature and send it off in the mail and hop on the next plane and go back and go sample things. So I put myself in this kind of unfortunate position that I had made this claim, but we didn't really have enough evidence to support it. And so it started getting questioned. So I had to keep going back and getting more data and trying to address the question better and more thoroughly that now my associate professor self would know to do, right? But I didn't know to do that when I was just a student. So that's led me down this road. So the first thing that's important about this is that it's a new subspecies no one ever knew it existed. We resurrected a name that had been proposed in 2012 to describe these samples, and it turns out that after now 25 years of really exploring it, we have massive amounts of data. We've gone from having one little part of mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited just from your mom and just tells the story of the females, to having complete genomes and lots of data to address this question. But it's still the same. There is this new subspecies of chimpanzee. But even more importantly is that the second thing that we discovered was that not only is there this one form of chimpanzee that occurs in Cameroon and adjacent parts of Nigeria, there's also another species of chimpanzees in Cameroon, and the ranges of these two groups come together in central Cameroon around a place called the Sanaga River, and it's also a place where the Congolian rainforest, the Ghanaian rainforest, and the savanna all come together and generate this massive amount of diversity. So basically, the area itself is really important because it's like a natural laboratory to study speciation and the processes that generate diversity in Central African taxa. And so that's kind of the core of my program, is that that's what we're really trying to do. It's a natural laboratory to understand ape speciation. It's really important for understanding our origins, for understanding how the environment affects genetic diversity, how the environment affects the culture of apes. So like all of these different things. So we can answer all these really comprehensive questions. So that's why I keep going back there. That's why I keep studying. And that's why those chimpanzees are really important in that particular area, because we can address questions there we can address anywhere else. And there's nowhere else in the world where you can study what it is that generates diversity in an ape. There's nowhere else you can study it. Only there, because we don't know anywhere else where the ranges of different subspecies overlap or come together.
I understand the IUCN Red List conservation plan for the Nigeria chimpanzee in Cameroon, Nigeria, has listed as few as 3,500 of these chimps in existence in the wild right now. Can you tell us what are the factors just contributing to these low numbers?
So that is the lower range estimate. The actual numbers, there's a lot of uncertainty in estimating population sizes, but as few as 3,500, as many as 9,000 Nigeria chimpanzees may exist in the wild. There are a lot of factors that have contributed to this decline. For apes in particular, hunting is a huge issue, especially in this area. The commercial bushmeat trade, as well as the pet trade, have all contributed to the massive decline in chimpanzees, and that's true across the continent. You know that more than 75% of chimpanzees have been lost in the last 100 years. So their numbers have really declined. That decline has been really exacerbated in Nigeria and Cameroon. Hunting is a big problem, but there are also issues with habitat lost, straight out lost, like deforestation. There's just no forest there. That's been shown very well actually in another area in over near Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal. Like, deforestation, the link between that and the loss of chimpanzees has been very well documented. Not as much in the area where we work, but certainly we're in Nigeria and Cameroon, but certainly most of the forest is gone, especially true in Nigeria. And the rate of loss is really accelerating in Cameroon, and much of what was there is lost. But more importantly than straight habitat loss is habitat degradation, right? Because apes especially they need to be in very, very remote areas, and the places where you find chimpanzees and gorillas nowadays is very, very remote. Certainly, there's ample evidence of that. Just one anecdotal thing: I was in a place called Ding Ding National Park, which is in the center of Cameroon, and I was actually looking for chimpanzees and gorillas. So I was following around this gorilla on its feeding trail, and we were right on it. We were there to collect fecal samples, which is what we collect now, and that's our source of DNA. And it was this really nice forest. The gorilla was eating a lot of food. But in the background, the reason why this protected area Ding Ding had been established was because there was a dam being built there. So I was looking for this gorilla, and in the background I could hear a caterpillar, a caterpillar bulldozer and backhoes. I could hear them building the road to make the dam. So that's actually, that's what I mean. Like that, I'm sure that those gorillas had to eventually retreat from that spot. But the problem is, on the other side of the reserve, there was a railroad. So even though there's pristine forest intact, oftentimes there's human impacts that have much bigger impacts on highly mobile animals like that are very reclusive. And then, so there's that. There's other problems too, like there's agricultural conversion, which can be good and bad. I've also spent an entire week following around gorillas who were raiding pineapple farms, and I was going along behind them raiding the pineapple farms too. So there's that kind of habitat degradation. There's the conversion of habitat for oil palm plantations. For example, there's a company here called Heracles, which proposed to build a giant oil palm plantation in the middle of unprotected habitat that connected 5 protected areas, 5 of the biggest protected areas in southwest Cameroon. So the conversion to monoculture is a really big problem as well. And then now we're finding that these other things that we didn't really expect to be big problems, to be big problems for chimpanzees, and that's climate change. And we're really starting to understand now, like, that climate change is going to affect chimpanzees, and it really will affect the level of diversity that we see in chimpanzees. I was very surprised. So one of my students, Paul Succinctly, completed a study where he showed that the Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzee and the standing diversity found within the subspecies, about 50% of it is likely to be lost as a result of changes, or as a result of climate change.
So this is a very important issue when we're considering the ecosystems that support human population throughout our very unique planet Earth. That we are not going to survive if we don't have the lower species, especially the primates, which are very close to the human population. And so we need to continue the research and mitigation of climate change. That's what we're here to get out to the audience, that we need to do something big time, because we've already escalated to 1.6 degrees centigrade. And as we start to lose these various species, our own existence is going to come into serious question, because we too are very much populating the Earth, and the population is expected to be 9 billion people by 2050, and that brings into to play other issues. Dr. Gonder, can you tell us how climate change is going to adversely affect the chimpanzee of Cameroon, Nigeria?
Right. Well, so we were very surprised to make that discovery. So a lot of what my research is to actually understand the relationship between genetic diversity, and environmental variation. So we look at that to kind of understand, how did the Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzee evolve? Why is Cameroon so important in chimpanzee evolution? We try to address those questions. So we started looking at the relationship between genes and environment, and basically what we found is that there are 2 different kinds, or 2 different populations that occur in 2 different kinds of habitats across Cameroon, regardless actually of what subspecies they belong to, if they're the Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzees or if they're Central African chimpanzees, which is Pan-troglodytes. So what we found was that within Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzees, there's the kind that lives in rainforests, and there's the kind that lives in this place that we call an ecotone. And an ecotone is an area where different kinds of habitats come together. So in this particular case, from the south, you have the Congo Basin that's coming up, and from the west, there's the Ghanaian rainforest. And these two forests meet and they merge and they create a matrix of forest and savanna habitats that eventually grades into this true savanna and Sahel and on into the Sahara Desert. So what we found was that while there's one population in these western rainforests in mountainous areas called the Gulf of Guinea Highlands, there's another population that exists in this ecotone area. So we were really surprised because we never expected to find chimpanzee genetic variation tied to environmental variation. So that led us to a whole bunch of questions. We're like, well, if it's tied to environmental variation, then that suggests that maybe there's, they might potentially be affected by climate change, especially depending on what ties them to the environment. And so a lot of our research is focused on that because the initial models that we got back, we used a lot of the different IPCC assessments, and we used those as layers in a map. And we were able to look at all these different scenarios of climate change and all these different environmental layers, and we can spatialize genetic diversity. And basically, we can make a map that's a composite of 1,000 layers of maps. We can look at one pixel through all 1,000 layers, the same pixel in all 1,000 layers, and then we can look even on the same map. We can look at different pixels. And what that allows us to do is this very flexible thing to let us understand, how does environmental variation affect chimpanzee genetic diversity or any other kind of diversity? We can project it backwards into the past, which is what I usually do, right, Tim, for evolutionary history. But then we realized we could project it forward into the future, which would tell us something about climate change. So anyway, so that's kind of what led us down this path of trying to understand climate change. So we started looking at these models as we had them. They were easy to do. They're also all available online. It's free. So we started looking at this, and we started looking at the different scenarios at 2020, or 2050, and 2080. And much to our dismay, we found that the population in this ecotone region was going to be completely gone by 2080. And even by 2020, you could start to see changes in the density of the population. So then that led us to, well, what could be changing, and why would that be so important? Well, it's not. The big issue is that there will be changes in seasonality and fruiting. Species will probably be replaced with different kinds of species. So this diversity that we see in this ecotone region, which is so important in so many species, is going to be lost. And if it's going to be lost in chimpanzees, that probably means that it's going to be lost in a lot of other species too. And it's all as a result of like those kind of like phenological changes as the forest advances and moves up. So that's really how the chimpanzees are going to be affected. And then there's the other ways too, like just generally in Central Africa, much to my surprise, when you think about climate change, you usually think about polar bears and melting ice and things like that. But Central Africa is one of the places that's likely to be most affected by climate change because of the intensity of storms, changes in growing seasons, which farmers are already documenting across the continent, and even worse, in Africa, they really lack the infrastructure and, quite frankly, the money to deal with problems like food security and things like that. So they have less of a focus on increased yield over a smaller area. There tends to be like agriculture in bigger areas. Right. People are more prone to famines. If they're more prone to famines, then they're more likely to eat bushmeat or wild meat that they gain from the forest. So Central Africa is changing, and it's less capable. It's less capable of resilience to climate change. Not like here, which is sad because the people that live there actually probably contribute the least to the reasons for climate change.
What do you think we could do? What do you think can be done about this adverse effect of climate change on the chimpanzees in Central Africa, this subspecies?
So the answer to that is actually pretty complex for this specific region, and it has pluses and minuses. One thing that is probably the most important thing is, hunting is still a really big problem. Enforcement of wildlife protection laws to stop the loss of chimpanzees would probably be the first line of defense, right? Another thing that is probably really important to save these particular chimpanzees is that in the ecotone, the habitats are being degraded, and there's increased there was increased agriculture around the national park and stuff like that. Those things are difficult to stop, but those should definitely be stopped. There shouldn't be any hunting in this one area. Mbamjiram National Park is this huge park that protects a lot of the ecotone. It's the size of the Grand Canyon, and we have this tiny little research station right in the center of it where we study chimpanzee socioecology, so we can understand, feeding ecology and how they sleep in different nests and things like that, and how that's likely to change over time. And some of the things that we've been finding and that park management authorities have been finding is that the forest is starting to advance from the south. And one of the reasons for this, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because there's protection on the one hand, and on one hand there's better protection, right? So there's not as much degradation of the habitat. But the thing is, what maintains that habitat is a long-term human practice of burning the forest back. And what they do is they burn the forest back. It keeps it as grassland, and that promotes all this diversity. So part of this is it's man-made. It's been going on for about 5,000 years, since the beginning of agriculture. So that's one thing that creates this patchwork of forests, and forest and savanna. So controlled burning is actually a really important part of their management plan in that specific area. And that's actually probably the easiest way to maintain that level of diversity. But that comes with a negative side too, right? Because if you're doing controlled burning, then you're releasing carbon into the atmosphere. So you may be contributing
carbon dioxide.
That you may be contributing more to the problem itself. So I don't know. I personally think that the conservation solution is that the loss of this, we're probably going to have to accept the loss of this particular unit of diversity within the Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzee. It's probably more important that some Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzees are left. Because we really don't know what happened. What will happen. It may be that, their habitat will shift north, but that isn't exactly what the models are showing right now. It's just showing that it's going to be gone. So I don't know. The other thing with chimpanzees is they're complicated animals. I mean, they're basically humans. I don't know about you, or I should say I'm an ape. I don't know how you people feel, but I'm an ape. They're very adaptable. They're really resilient. They can adapt pretty well, so they might be able to retain that reservoir, the distinctiveness of these ecotone chimpanzees. But I don't know. The solution to that is probably just to make sure that they're still around in some form.
Are there any plans to bring them into a more protected area where they could be safe from hunters? These hunters that are operating outside of the existing laws and regulation, and the loss of land mass of their protected area by the, like you said, the burning of the forest periodically, and the construction area. On the other side of the protected area. Well,
just in general, probably the best thing to do is just save the ones that remain, right, and not disturb them and let them reproduce. The reason why, I mean, you can't just introduce chimpanzees back to an area. They're highly territorial. It's not like you could release one and it would be integrated into a group. It would be killed. That because they're very warlike. Chimpanzees are very warlike species. They're very
animals.
territorial.
Okay.
And and if they were locally extinct in an area, but the habitat was still good, yeah, the possibility exists there. A situation like that does exist. So chimpanzees are or were heavily hunted for the bushmeat trade. That is starting to change a little bit, and also for the pet trade. And what happens with chimpanzees is that in order to take one baby or to the pet trade, or to even kill a chimpanzee and take it out of the forest to eat it, you have to kill the entire group. And you have to kill even the mother. And so oftentimes what happens is that the mothers, they've been shot, they'll fall out of the trees, but the babies will survive the fall out of the tree, right? And so hunters will take these babies. They can get a lot of money for them, but equally as true, they're cute. They're like humans, they'll take them home, and then the cute little baby chimpanzee that they saved and they took home and let their kids raise it turns into a big, giant, scary chimpanzee that is very warlike, right? So these animals end up in sanctuaries. So Cameroon and Nigeria actually have had the first ape sanctuaries in all across the whole continent. Right now, there are 3 sanctuaries in Cameroon. There's the Limbe Wildlife Center, there's the Sanaga Young Rehabilitation Center, and there's a place called Ape Action Africa. It's in Mefu National Park. All of these hold these orphan chimpanzees in captivity with the idea that they would release them back into the wild. That has been the long-term goal of all these sanctuaries, is that eventually they would go out of business by releasing all of their animals. Unfortunately, releasing animals back into the wild has proven to be very difficult because there's a whole complex level of things that you have to consider. So first of all, you have to find intact forest, right? That would be able to sustain them. It still has the breadth of diversity to, with all the fruits and nuts and ants and bees and all the things that chimpanzees need to live. So that's one criteria. The second thing is you can't release a chimpanzee in a place where there are other chimpanzees. You can't release also a chimpanzee alone. Chimpanzee has know how to live in the wild. So there's that. And then there's the other side of the equation. What's going on with the people that are there? Are the people going to come and hunt the chimpanzees? Would they kill them and eat them anyway? Or do they want chimpanzees? Do they care if they're there raiding their pineapple garden? So there's a whole series of questions that have to be dealt with. And in order to release an individual that's been raised in captivity, chimpanzees are not like wolves. Like the wolves have been released back into Yellowstone. Chimpanzees are raised by, especially those in sanctuaries, are raised by basically human surrogates. And they get bottles. It's not like, they know how to go find whatever exotic fruit there is, or that they would have their mothers to learn from, So they have to be, if you release them into the wild, they have to at least be provisioned occasionally so that they can continue to live as they learn how to live out in the wild. But it's a very complex thing. So, in answer to your question, is that a viable prospect for keeping chimpanzees here on planet Earth? No, probably not. We might, some limited reintroductions might be possible, but the possibility of just like releasing a lot of them and having them repopulate would probably not work in the case of apes. They're just too much like us.
Dr. Gonder, can you tell us, for the general listening audience, how the members of our listening audience in the Philadelphia area and the Camden area of New Jersey, what can we do specifically to be of help in trying to mitigate the adverse effects on the species, in addition to reducing our own carbon footprint? Could you make a recommendation?
Well, one of the most important things you can do immediately would be to write to your congressperson and ask them to be more sensitive to legislation that comes through that deals with research and that deals with funding conservation. So 2 things that we have faced recently is that there's been a very big decline in NSF-funded climate change research. And given our current our current political reality, it seems likely that that funding will decline. Not only do we need to stop the decline and return it to previous levels, more funding is needed to carry out climate change research like what we were able to find with chimpanzees. Another thing I would encourage the people to include in these letters is that there's a really underappreciated role that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service plays in the international conservation arena. International conservation, that directorate within Fish and Wildlife Service, they fund a lot of great apes conservation work. Like they funded the IUCN Conservation Action Plan for the Nigeria Cameroon chimpanzee, which allowed us to come up with the population number, that there's a minimum estimate of 3,500. We were able to bring together stakeholders from all across the region to have us all sit down and look at all of the information to make an assessment that was valuable for IUCN. So the Fish and Wildlife Service International Conservation Unit needs to continue being funded, and it needs more funding, because in most areas of the world where apes still exist, the infrastructure is really not there to really protect great apes. So that's the other thing that I would suggest.
So writing letters to our respective congressional elected officials would certainly help get the funding back that's been cut. And we would like to ask everybody in the listening audience to write a letter, make a phone call, send an email, do all three, go to your congressional representative's office, be it in Harrisburg or here in Philadelphia or in Trenton, New Jersey, and make your case. Make your case to your. This is the people's house. The Congress is the people's house. They don't know what the people want them to do and vote on, and bills to introduce, unless you and myself all make it known to our elected officials. We have a representative democracy, which means that we don't go to Washington, but we tell our representatives in Washington how to vote and how to spend our tax dollars on our behalf. And unless they hear your voice and my voice and all of our voices, they don't know what we want them to do. And so they do whatever they want to do. So we would ask you at WKDU to make your desire known that the funding needs to be increased over and above what's already been cut from NSF. And we will give you some links to address your letter and links to your representatives on the website for this series. So we thank you very much for coming to talk to us and offering the benefit of your distinguished research career.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about my research, and to KDU for hosting this great upcoming radio show.